Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Do Yourself No Harm, the podcast and YouTube series that helps busy and overwhelmed professionals and entrepreneurs to overcome burnout. I'm Dr. Claire Ashley. I'm a GP and burnout survivor and expert. I'm really pleased to announce that shortly I will be launching my signature Beat Burnout Recovery course. This course encompasses everything that I have learned about burnout. It will be a real deep dive into the causes of burnout, how to recognize it, how to recover, and how to stay recovered as well. It will draw on my own personal experiences with burnout, as well as my clinical experience as a doctor and a GP, and my own academic experience as an undergraduate neuroscientist and with my postgraduate certificate in public health. If you would like to be the first to know more about when the course is launched, then please sign up to the waiting list. The link is in the bio. As always, if you enjoy this episode, please hit like and subscribe. Now today, I'm going to be talking about the cost of living crisis and how I think it is likely to affect the mental health of both professionals and entrepreneurs over the coming few months. On a personal note, I'm actually quite deeply concerned about the impact of the cost of living crisis and how it is likely to increase burnout rates in particular, but also how much harder it's going to become to recover from burnout as a result of the cost of living crisis. So let's start by putting this all into a bit of context. Let's talk about where we currently are at in the UK. So we have an economy that isn't really recovering, I would say, as we might have hoped or expected after the pandemic. I'm not an economist, an economist. Oh my goodness me! Do you know what? I'm not even gonna edit that out because that's just really funny. I can't even say the word economist, let alone pretend that I am one. However, we're in a sticky situation. Brexit has already made things very difficult for the UK, both politically and economically, and we're pretty much already in a recession. So the Bank of England hasn't officially said, because we've not officially hit the criteria for it, but they've said we're on track to end up being in a recession by the time that they release their figures at the end of the next quarter, I believe. Our energy bills are quite literally out of control thanks to instability in the Ukraine and Russia, and inflation is currently in double digits. Then, a couple of weeks ago, the mini budget was announced, and I think it's probably not unfair to say that it was basically a total omnishambles. I'm not going to swear because this is a family-friendly podcast. Hopefully no children are listening to this. Burnout is not really a topic for children, I would say. However, I do like to keep it clean. That's being kind, saying that the budget was an omnishambles. So basically the pound went into free fall. Banks pulled loads of mortgage products because the interest rates are just skyrocketing. The Bank of England had to buy up £65 billion worth of government debt in order to prevent £1 trillion worth of pension funds collapsing. Like, we literally came within 24 hours of pensions just being annihilated. So this is really, really big what's happening right now, and potentially very, very serious. Now, this week we've had the Tory party conference, and whilst Kwasi Kwarteng has now backed down on one of the measures in the mini budget that he announced, he's backed down on the removal of the highest tax rate, a huge amount of damage has already been done, and we weren't in a great place economically before that disastrous mini budget was announced anyway. So what does this mean for our collective and individual mental health, and why should we even care? Well, just in pure economic terms, it matters. The cost of burnout and other stress-related illnesses is around, currently, 53 to 56 billion pounds a year. Now, I cannot see this figure going anywhere but up, given the current cost of living crisis. And you know, if we see burnout rates go up, not only does it have a huge impact on productivity and economic growth, it puts a huge strain on the NHS as well. So already the NHS is in a crisis when it comes to managing her mental health problems. And I know this because I'm a GP and I deal with mental health problems and the crisis that the service is under on an almost daily basis. We estimate in general practice that about 1 in 4 consultations are about mental health as the primary problem. Pretty much every consultation has an element of mental health involved in it, but 1 in 4 on average are purely about mental health problems. So that's anxiety, depression, PTSD, other mental health disorders. Now, the gold standard for the majority of mental health problems is psychological support, so therapy. However, In my area, you will wait a year, to see a therapist on the NHS. So if you cannot afford to go private, by the time you get to see your therapist a year down the line, your mental health problem will be that much more embedded, that much more complex, more significant, and the symptoms will be that much more bigger and significant as well. That means that your recovery is going to be more difficult. So that means that the time that you spend with that problem and recovering from that problem is going to be longer. And that then has fallout effects not only on the individual and their relationships, but also on their work. The crisis service, in my opinion, is in complete disarray. And again, that's being very kind because I can't swear. So our mental health services, the NHS is already stretched without the added complications of an impending economic crisis. And I've no doubt that the numbers of people presenting with mental health problems will go up significantly as a result of a recession. And we're already failing our patients with these problems as it stands. And we haven't even started the winter yet. So let's talk about burnout specifically and how I think that the cost of living crisis will affect it. Well, firstly, I've already mentioned that I think that burnout rates will go up. So burnout occurs when you have been exposed to a prolonged period of stress at work that has not been successfully managed. That's the definition, right? And without a doubt, regardless of which sector you're in, whether you're in the public sector, whether you're in the private sector, the pressure is going to be on for you to deliver the same standard of work or a higher standard of work with fewer physical and financial resources. And that is going to be really stressful. For some people, the crisis might mean having to take on additional hours or a second job, and that also will be a risk factor for burnout. And the economic crisis is already causing considerable suffering to working professionals. So not just people that don't have jobs, but people who are actually in work. So for instance, we're already seeing significant numbers of nurses using food banks to help feed themselves and their children. Now, this literally blows my mind, right? We are one of the richest countries in the world. Nurses are university educated, professional working people, right? They are hugely committed. They're very hardworking. They work really long days as well. I mean, most nursing shifts are 12 to 13 hours, right? And yet we still have nurses who cannot afford to feed themselves or their families despite the fact that they are working for the NHS, which just isn't right in my opinion. But this is already happening, and this is a fact, you cannot deny it. And as the cost of living crisis really bites, those figures are only going to get worse. And those people, those professionals, those people in work who end up needing additional support, either financially or with accommodation or with the basic task of feeding yourself, you know, it's going to put burnout rates up. If you're a freelancer without the security of a regular income, then the cost of living crisis means that you are likely to going to need more hours. And again, this will put you at risk of burnout. And if you are an entrepreneur, then the pressure will be on to keep money coming in to pay the bills and your salary. And if you employ other people, then it's going to be really, really hard. And the self-imposed pressure to make money will force people to work harder and longer hours. And all of this is the perfect storm for burnout, right? We also have the problem that we still don't know how the economic crisis is going to pan out. And the uncertainty with dealing with that makes it really hard to know what to do with our jobs and our careers. There's also a lot of anxiety and fear out there at the moment, which is 100% being perpetuated by the media. And again, this just fuels that cycle of anxiety and uncertainty and fear, and we end up spiraling with our mental health. When it comes to people who are currently burnt out, as I've mentioned before, a lot in my social media, but also on here, you absolutely have to make changes to your work in order to recover from your burnout. You cannot recover from burnout if nothing changes at work, right? It's just a fact, and I can't sugarcoat that, unfortunately. But in a cost of living crisis, your choices and your options for change at work will be limited because of it. And that's really, really hard to deal with. So what can we do to try to prevent burnout from happening and to help those who are currently burnt out during this economic crisis? Well, firstly, I think that there has to be action at the systemic and organisational level. So burnout isn't the problem of the individual that burns out. This is something that I've talked about time and time again. So whilst there are, for the individual that burns out, whilst there are individual factors and internal factors that individual can go away and work on in order to reduce their risk factors for burnout, in order to change their coping strategies, etc., etc., you have to address the root cause of the problem, which is the pressure at work. Let's go back to the definition of burnout. Burnout only happens when you've been subject to a prolonged and intense period of stress at work that has not been successfully managed. So organisations and systems have to take responsibility for protecting the mental health and mental well-being of their staff. And that's hard to do when times are economically tough, because essentially what they'll do is they'll look at the bottom line and they'll view it as something that's not essential. But what I would say to those people that are making those decisions is just, if it's about the numbers, look at the sheer economical cost and productivity cost to your organisation for the people that burn out. Not only does burnout hit the individual hard, it also costs organisations money. It is better to prevent burnout from happening in the first place, both on an individual level, but also on a systemic level as well. That means things like adequate compensation for staff and making them feel valued. If you can't put people's wages up, how can you help their experience at work? How can you make them feel valued and part of a good team? That means creating a psychologically safe space to work, creating functional teams and a supportive culture. That goes a long way to supporting the mental well-being of staff. So, for instance, I have a friend who works in an NHS trust who sent out like an email communication about the cost of living crisis. And in this email, they basically said, we can't change your rates of pay because they're nationally governed and we have no influence over it. But we realise that times are tough and we want to do our best to try to support you. And they basically had a whole raft of measures that covered a whole range of things like transport to and from the hospital, access to parking, access to hot foods and drinks, that legitimately do make a difference, not only to people's outgoings, but also just how they feel at work. To feel valued by your employer goes a long way. Talking about the system and the Tory party, don't forget your democratic rights. And when the time comes, as my friend Hannah from Wellbeing Done Well states, go for a run, eat some chocolates and vote them out. Now, in terms of what you can do as an individual, now I've talked about how you need to make changes at work if you're burnt out, right? Remember that you always have choice when it comes to your job and your career, even in times of an economic crisis. They might not be the choices that you had hoped for or wanted, but you do always have choice. And even if you're burnt out, you can still make changes to your work. Now, in the course that I'm developing, we're going to cover this topic in quite a lot of detail. So, quick little bit of promotional work here. So please do consider signing up for the waitlist. I'm going to be running a little challenge in my Facebook group, and then I'm going to be delivering a masterclass on burnout recovery before I cover what's going to be in the course. But this is going to be something that we're going to go into in quite a lot of depth. We're going to cover career development if you cannot leave the job that you're in, and also career development outside of the job that you're currently in as well. But if you're not planning to join in, then what I recommend that you do is that you Google this concept called job crafting. So job crafting is basically how you can mould and shape the job that you already have to make it into something that works better for you and your needs and your mental health. And it's very helpful to do this post-burnout, particularly if you're not able to leave your current role. So you always have options, even if you feel that they are limited. And I think it's helpful to be reminded of that sometimes. Now, regardless of whether you are a professional or whether you're in like an employed role, or whether you're a freelancer or an entrepreneur, you must prioritize having adequate downtime and adequate rest time, both in your working day and outside of work as well. So during your working day, make sure that you're not taking on too work, be very boundaried about what you do and do not take on, and factor in regular breaks. In terms of both burnout prevention and burnout recovery, it's better to have lots of little short breaks interspersed throughout your working day than to wait for one big long break. And that goes for both during the working day and for outside of your working day as well. So for instance, it's not really good enough to save up like all of your annual leave and have like a big summer holiday to help your mental well-being. It's better to have regular short breaks, for instance. Fill your recovery time with low cost activities that mean that you can worry much less about how much you're spending. So, the things that really matter for our mental well being in terms of the evidence are free. So, things like social connections, getting outside, doing some physical activity, these things don't have to cost much, if anything at all. And there's a huge evidence base around how beneficial they are for your mental health and well being. So, prioritize those things in your downtime. And the other thing to remember is that if you are in genuine financial difficulty, do not bury your head in the sand. Take early action. There's no shame in asking for help for financial difficulties. And if you are in that place, the Citizens Advice Bureau is a really great place to start. If you're a member of a union, then they might be able to provide some support as well. And charities such as Shelter can help with accommodation issues. The Trussell Trust can help with food issues. You can always call the Samaritans as well, just for someone to listen to you. Their number is 116123. Don't face it alone. Get help. And don't forget as well that your GP also can help. Every practice will have access to someone called a social prescriber, and they'll be able to link you in with lots of different services that are, kind of in your local area. So don't forget that too. And finally, whilst I do think that this is going to be a very, very difficult period, I genuinely don't think it's going to be forever. And I think sometimes just reminding ourselves that our pain or our limited choices are just temporary can be really helpful, and it can get you through that difficult period. I also recommend that you go and listen to the podcast that I did previously with Dr. Sarah Goulding on how to make decisions in times of uncertainty. So it's very medic focused, but the principles can be applied to anyone in any sector or any job. And she had, Sarah's just incredible. She had this, so much information about how to deal with uncertainty and living in a time of crisis. So I hope that this has been helpful. As always, if you enjoyed, then please hit like and subscribe, and I will see you all soon. Take care.